There is something I've noticed about silence that nobody really talks about. People usually think silence means nothing is happening, that if someone isn't calling, texting, or showing up, then they've already moved on. I used to believe that too, until one conversation completely changed the way I looked at no contact. A close friend of mine disappeared from someone's life after a painful misunderstanding. Months passed without a single message, and everyone around him assumed he had forgotten her. Then one evening, while we were having coffee, he admitted something that caught me completely off guard. He said, "Every day I told myself not to reach out, and every day I lost the argument with my own thoughts." That confession stayed with me because it revealed something people rarely admit out loud. Sometimes silence isn't proof that feelings disappeared. Sometimes it's proof that someone has been fighting those feelings so hard that they've exhausted themselves. That is exactly the energy surrounding today's reading. This doesn't feel like someone who has become emotionally detached. It feels like someone who has reached the point where pretending requires more effort than simply telling the truth. As I focused on today's cards, one message kept repeating itself in my mind. The person you've been separated from is no longer protecting themselves with emotional distance the way they once did. For a long time, they convinced themselves that keeping everything locked inside was the smartest decision. They believed that if they stayed quiet long enough, their emotions would eventually fade into the background like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. Instead, the opposite happened. The longer they avoided their feelings, the more those feelings demanded attention. It's very similar to trying to ignore a small crack in the wall of a house. At first, it seems insignificant, something that can wait until another day. But over time, the crack widens, and eventually it reaches a point where pretending it doesn't exist becomes impossible. That is where this person finds themselves now. The emotional pressure they've been carrying has quietly built over time, and now it refuses to remain hidden. The first card immediately points toward realization rather than action. That's important because genuine change almost never begins with dramatic gestures. It begins with an uncomfortable moment of honesty that nobody else sees. Imagine someone driving home after work, stopping at a traffic light they pass every day without thinking twice. This time, however, a song starts playing on the radio that reminds them of someone they haven't spoken to in months. They tell themselves it's only a coincidence, but then another reminder appears later that evening. Perhaps an old photograph while scrolling through their phone, or a familiar place they accidentally drive past. None of these moments seem powerful on their own, yet together, they slowly dismantle the story they've been telling themselves. They begin asking questions they had carefully avoided. Why does this person still occupy my thoughts? Why do ordinary moments keep leading me back to them? Why have I been working so hard to convince myself that none of this matters? Those questions don't arrive with loud drama. They arrive quietly, but once they appear, they rarely disappear again. One of the strongest impressions I receive from this card is that your person has finally started separating pride from truth. Those two things often become tangled after a connection ends. Pride whispers that staying silent proves strength, while truth quietly reminds us that unspoken emotions never stop existing simply because we refuse to acknowledge them. For a long time, they allowed pride to make their decisions. They focused on appearing unaffected instead of asking themselves whether they actually were. Eventually, that strategy began to collapse under its own weight. It's like carrying a heavy suitcase through an airport while insisting it's not heavy. At first, you manage because adrenaline keeps you moving. After enough time, though, your shoulders begin to ache, your hands become tired, and every additional step feels harder than the last. The weight didn't suddenly increase. You simply reached the point where pretending became more exhausting than admitting you needed to set it down. Emotionally, your person has reached that exact place. Let me give you a practical example, because this energy feels incredibly realistic. Imagine a woman who ends a relationship believing she's making the logical choice. She throws herself into work, accepts extra responsibilities, spends more time with friends, and keeps telling herself she's happier now. Outwardly, everything appears normal. Yet every Friday evening, when life finally slows down, she catches herself wondering how that one person is doing. She never sends the message she's thinking about because she tells herself it would only complicate things. Week after week, she repeats the same routine until one day she realizes something that surprises even her. She isn't afraid of rejection anymore. She's afraid of discovering how much time she wasted pretending she didn't care. That realization changes everything, because once someone becomes more afraid of regret than vulnerability, their entire emotional direction begins to shift. This card also suggests that they've stopped trying to explain away what they feel. Earlier, they searched for logical reasons to dismiss every emotional reaction. They blamed stress, loneliness, timing, work, distance, or simple curiosity. Now, those explanations no longer satisfy them because the emotions have remained consistent despite every attempt to rationalize them. Instead of asking why these feelings still exist, they're beginning to accept that they simply do. That acceptance doesn't automatically mean they'll rush back into your life tomorrow, but it does mean something significant has changed inside them. They are no longer spending all their energy hiding from themselves. Before anyone can speak honestly to another person, they must first become honest with the person they see in the mirror. According to this first card, that private conversation has already begun. And once it starts, it's incredibly difficult to silence again. As I continued sitting with this energy, the next card shifted the entire atmosphere of the reading. The first card revealed that your person could no longer hide from what they were feeling. This second card explains why. It points towards someone who has finally realized that silence gave them temporary comfort, but permanent questions. There comes a moment in every emotionally significant connection when people stop asking, was staying quiet the right decision? And start asking, what has my silence actually cost me? Those are two completely different questions. The first protects the ego because it focuses on being right. The second opens the heart because it focuses on what has been lost. Your person appears to have crossed that invisible line. They are no longer measuring the situation by who had the stronger pride or who walked away first. Instead, they're measuring it by everything they never allowed themselves to experience, because they kept their emotions locked behind carefully built walls. Think about someone standing outside a house during a heavy rainstorm. They have the key in their pocket, but instead of opening the door, they convince themselves they can endure the weather a little longer. At first, it seems manageable. They're uncomfortable, but they believe they're proving something to themselves by refusing to go inside. Hours pass, the rain becomes colder, and eventually they realize the only person suffering from their decision is themselves. The house was never locked. The opportunity to seek shelter was always there. They simply refused to use it. Emotional distance often works the same way. Many people mistake emotional restraint for emotional strength, only to discover later that they weren't protecting themselves at all. They were simply postponing the vulnerability that eventually becomes unavoidable. This card feels exactly like that realization. Your person is beginning to understand that every feeling they postponed didn't disappear. It simply waited for them. One of the strongest impressions coming through is that they have been replaying ordinary memories instead of dramatic ones. That's what makes this energy feel genuine. When people truly miss someone, they rarely think about grand declarations or unforgettable vacations. They remember the tiny moments that seemed insignificant at the time. They remember laughing over something completely ridiculous. They remember the way you looked at them when they were explaining a story. They remember the comfortable silence during a drive when neither of you felt the need to fill every second with conversation. Those quiet moments suddenly become priceless because they represented something much deeper than excitement. They represented emotional safety. Your person is beginning to recognize that the things they once overlooked were actually the foundation of what made your connection meaningful. Imagine a man who used to stop by the same bakery every Saturday morning because his partner loved fresh bread. After the relationship ended, He continued buying coffee there without thinking much about it. One weekend, the cashier asked, "No cinnamon loaf today?" It was such an ordinary question that it caught him completely off guard. He stood there in silence because for the first time he realized he had unconsciously continued visiting the same place every week, even though the person he originally went there for was no longer beside him. He smiled politely, paid for his coffee, walked back to his car, and sat there much longer than he intended. It wasn't the bread that upset him. It was the realization that part of his life had continued making space for someone his heart had never truly let go of. That's how these emotions often return, not through dramatic events, but through simple routines that quietly expose the truth we've been avoiding. This card also reveals something else that deserves attention. Your person has stopped viewing vulnerability as weakness. Earlier in this journey, they believed that admitting how deeply they cared would somehow place them at a disadvantage. They thought expressing emotions meant surrendering control. Many people grow up believing that the less they reveal, the safer they'll be. While that mindset may protect them from temporary disappointment, it also prevents genuine closeness from ever developing. Eventually, they reach a stage where they realize that protecting themselves from pain has also protected them from love. That realization can be incredibly unsettling because it forces someone to question years of emotional habits. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid getting hurt?" they begin asking, "What have I missed because I refuse to be honest?" According to this card, your person is beginning to ask themselves that very question. Another image comes to mind as I sit with this energy. Picture someone carrying a letter in their coat pocket for months. They wrote it during a moment of complete honesty, but never gathered the courage to send it. Every time they put on that coat, they feel the folded paper resting inside the pocket. Sometimes they think about throwing it away, yet they never do. Sometimes they promise themselves they'll finally mail it tomorrow, but tomorrow always becomes another excuse. Eventually, the edges of the paper become worn, not because it has been read countless times, but because it has been carried everywhere. The letter itself becomes a symbol of everything they couldn't say. Your person's emotions feel remarkably similar. They have been carrying conversations inside themselves for much longer than anyone realizes. The words have changed over time, but the desire to express them has quietly remained. One practical example that perfectly matches this card involves two people who stopped speaking after a disagreement neither of them truly wanted. Months later, one of them attended a mutual friend's wedding. During the speeches, everyone laughed at stories about love, commitment, and second chances. While everyone else enjoyed the celebration, this individual found themselves staring across the room, wondering how life might have looked if they had simply chosen one honest conversation instead of weeks of silence. Weddings, birthdays, holidays, and milestones have a strange way of making people reflect on the relationships that mattered most. It's rarely because those events are magical. It's because moments of happiness often highlight the empty spaces we've been pretending not to notice. That is exactly the emotional environment surrounding your person right now. Life itself has become a mirror, constantly reflecting the places where your absence is quietly felt. The message becomes even clearer when we look beneath the surface. This isn't someone who suddenly woke up one morning overwhelmed by emotion. This has been building gradually through countless private moments that nobody else has witnessed. Every reminder, every memory, every unanswered question has slowly chipped away at the emotional distance they worked so hard to maintain. They've discovered something that surprises many people after no contact. Avoiding communication doesn't necessarily create emotional freedom. Sometimes it simply creates emotional suspense. The conversation never truly ends. It continues inside someone's mind, replaying itself in different versions until they finally accept that only honesty can bring real closure, or perhaps a new beginning. Perhaps the most significant shift revealed by this card is that they no longer feel the need to appear unaffected. For a long time, maintaining that image seemed important. They wanted the world to believe they were perfectly fine, that everything had been neatly placed behind them. But appearances become exhausting when they no longer match reality. Eventually, people grow tired of performing a version of themselves that feels increasingly disconnected from what they're actually experiencing. Your person appears to be approaching that point now. The emotional mask they once wore so confidently has become difficult to keep in place because the truth underneath keeps demanding to be acknowledged. This brings us directly to the heart of your title. They are no longer protecting you from how they truly feel. More importantly, they are no longer protecting themselves from admitting those feelings either. That internal battle has reached a turning point. And once someone becomes emotionally honest with themselves, the possibility of becoming emotionally honest with someone else grows much stronger. The silence that once felt permanent is beginning to lose its purpose because the reasons that created it no longer hold the same power they once did. Something inside them has changed, and while the outside world may not see it yet, the inner transformation has already begun. That quiet shift is often where the most meaningful stories truly start. As I turned over the next card, I noticed something that completely changed the emotional direction of this reading. Until now, we've been looking at what has been happening inside your person's mind. This card moves beyond thought and into consequence. There is a tremendous difference between realizing you love someone and realizing what your silence has cost you. The first, realization, creates emotion. The second, creates urgency. Your person is no longer sitting comfortably inside the story they created to protect themselves. They're beginning to recognize that every day spent avoiding the truth has quietly rewritten the future they once imagined. This isn't about panic or desperation. It's about waking up to the uncomfortable understanding that time never stops moving simply because we aren't ready to make a decision. While they convince themselves, there would always be another opportunity to explain, another chance to apologize, another moment to clear the air. Life continued moving forward. That realization carries a weight they can no longer ignore. One of the strongest impressions I receive is that they're revisiting conversations that never actually happened. That may sound strange, but it's incredibly common when someone carries unresolved emotions. Have you ever replayed an argument in your head and thought of all the things you wish you had said? Or imagined how differently a moment could have unfolded if only you had been brave enough to speak honestly? That's exactly where your person is emotionally. Except these aren't just random daydreams anymore. They're becoming regular companions. They imagine what they would say if you suddenly appeared in front of them. They rehearse apologies while driving alone. They picture your reactions, your questions, even the expressions on your face. Ironically, they have become better at communicating with the version of you inside their imagination than they ever were when you were standing in front of them. That realization is humbling because it forces them to admit that fear, not circumstance, was often the greatest obstacle between the two of you. I want to share another practical example because I think it captures this energy beautifully. Imagine a woman who owned a small bookstore. Every Wednesday afternoon, the same customer stopped by after work. At first, they spoke only about novels, but over time, their conversations became longer. They talked about childhood memories, favorite places to travel, family traditions, and dreams they hadn't shared with many people. There was obvious chemistry, but neither of them addressed it directly. Each believed the other would eventually make the first move. Then, one Wednesday, the customer simply stopped coming. Weeks turned into months. One afternoon, while reorganizing a shelf, the woman found a book he had recommended years earlier. Inside was a bookmark he had accidentally left behind. Suddenly, she wasn't thinking about the unfinished conversation in the bookstore. She was thinking about every opportunity both of them allowed to pass because they believed there would always be another Wednesday. Life rarely announces when the last ordinary moment has already happened. Often we only recognize its importance long after it has passed. Your person is beginning to understand that painful truth. This card also carries an interesting emotional contrast. On one hand, they still wrestle with uncertainty. On the other hand, they have become surprisingly certain about one thing. They can no longer convince themselves that your connection meant less than it actually did. Earlier, they tried reducing everything to timing, circumstance, or simple attraction. Now, those explanations feel shallow compared to what they're experiencing internally. They've begun separating temporary conflict from lasting significance. Just because a relationship encounters difficulties doesn't mean the emotional impact disappears. In fact, some of the most meaningful connections leave the deepest imprint precisely because they remain unfinished. Your person appears to be confronting that reality for the first time without trying to escape it. Another image comes to mind as I sit with this card. Picture someone restoring an old family photograph that has become faded over the years. At first, the picture looks blurry, almost impossible to make out. But as they carefully remove dust and repair small imperfections, details slowly begin to emerge. Faces become clearer, smiles become visible. Expressions once hidden return to life. Memory works in much the same way. During emotional distance, people often remember only the conflicts because those moments justify staying apart. As time passes and emotions settle, the mind begins restoring everything else. Suddenly, they remember your kindness during difficult seasons, your patience when they doubted themselves, your ability to make ordinary evenings feel memorable, and the quiet comfort of simply knowing you were there. The emotional picture becomes clear with time instead of fading away. That appears to be happening for your person now. There's another reason this card feels significant. I don't sense someone who wants to rewrite history by pretending mistakes never happened. Instead, I sense someone who finally understands those mistakes. That distinction matters because genuine growth doesn't erase the past, it learns from it. Imagine an experienced carpenter building a table. If one measurement is slightly off, the entire structure becomes unstable. The carpenter doesn't blame the wood. They don't blame the tools. They examine the measurement because that's where the problem began. Emotionally, your person seems to be doing something similar. They're no longer blaming circumstances, distance, or bad timing for everything that happened. They're asking themselves where fear influenced their choices and how those choices gradually created the distance they now regret. Let me give you another practical example. Think about two longtime friends who slowly developed feelings for one another but never spoke openly because they feared ruining the friendship. One eventually accepted a job in another city. At first, they promised to stay in touch. But life became busy, conversations became shorter, and eventually months passed without meaningful communication. Years later, they happened to meet again at a reunion. Neither of them expressed anger. Neither blamed the other. Instead, there was a quiet sadness that came from realizing how much life had changed because of conversations that never happened. They weren't grieving what they had lost. They were grieving what they never allowed themselves to build. Your person's emotional landscape feels remarkably similar. They're not simply remembering what was. They're imagining what could have been had they chosen honesty over hesitation. What strikes me most about this card is that it doesn't carry the energy of someone trying to win. Earlier, they may have viewed no contact almost like a contest of emotional endurance. Whoever reached out first would appear weaker. Whoever stayed silent longer would appear stronger. That mindset has quietly dissolved because life has taught them something far more valuable. Real relationships aren't measured by who maintains control the longest. They're measured by who has the courage to protect the connection rather than the ego. This realization often arrives later than people wish, but once it does, it permanently changes the way they view the past. Another subtle message emerges here. Your person has started noticing qualities about you they once took for granted. It's fascinating how familiarity sometimes hides value. When someone becomes part of our daily life, we begin expecting the little things without fully appreciating them. We expect the encouraging messages, the thoughtful questions, the willingness to listen after a difficult day, the laughter that lightens ordinary moments. Only after those things disappear do many people realize how much emotional stability they quietly provided. Your absence has become a teacher in ways your presence never could. It has shown them that what felt ordinary was actually extraordinary because it came from someone who cared deeply. The emotional atmosphere continues becoming more vulnerable with every card. This no longer feels like someone trying to suppress their heart. It feels like someone standing at the edge of a decision they've postponed for far too long. They're beginning to understand that protecting themselves from rejection also protected them from the possibility of reconciliation, healing, or even simple honesty. The silence that once felt safe now feels incomplete. Every passing day adds another reminder that unresolved emotions don't simply vanish. They wait patiently until we're finally willing to face them. As this card comes to a close, one message echoes louder than the rest. Your person isn't changing because someone pressured them to change. They're changing because their own heart has become impossible to ignore. That kind of transformation is often the most lasting because it grows from genuine self-awareness rather than outside influence. Whether they choose to act immediately or need more time to gather the courage remains part of their personal journey. However, the emotional direction is unmistakable. They are no longer running from what they feel. Instead, they're slowly walking toward a truth they once believed they could avoid forever. And that inner shift prepares the ground for everything the next card is about to reveal. The next card carries an energy that feels remarkably different from everything we've explored so far. Up until this point, your person's journey has been deeply internal. They have been wrestling with memories, questioning old decisions, and slowly peeling away the emotional armor they built around themselves. But this card introduces something new. It suggests they are no longer asking themselves whether they have feelings. That question has already been answered. Instead, they are beginning to wonder what happens if they continue pretending those feelings don't exist. There comes a stage in every meaningful connection where avoiding the truth becomes more frightening than speaking it. Your person appears to be standing at that exact crossroads. They're discovering that every day spent hiding behind silence isn't protecting them anymore. It's quietly increasing the distance between the life they have and the life they secretly wish they had. One thing that immediately stands out is the amount of self-reflection taking place. This doesn't feel like someone blaming circumstances or convincing themselves that everything happened because of bad timing. They're becoming painfully aware of their own choices. That's an uncomfortable place for anyone to be, because accountability asks questions that excuses never can. They're beginning to recognize the conversations they avoided, the moments when vulnerability could have changed everything, and the opportunities they allowed fear to steal from them. That realization isn't arriving all at once. It's unfolding gradually, almost like watching the sun rise after a long night. At first, the light is barely noticeable, but with every passing moment, more of the landscape becomes visible. Suddenly, they can see details that were hidden in the darkness. Emotionally, that's exactly what's happening. Their perspective is becoming clear, and with clarity comes responsibility. Imagine a father teaching his teenage son how to repair an old bicycle. The boy becomes frustrated because every time he fixes one problem, another one appears. Finally, his father smiles and says, "The bicycle isn't fighting you. It's showing you every place that needs your attention." Years later, that lesson stays with him, not because it was about bicycles, but because it explained life. Relationships often work the same way. They don't expose our weaknesses to embarrass us. They reveal them so we have the opportunity to grow. Your person seems to be reaching that understanding now. Instead of viewing your connection as something that caused discomfort, they're beginning to see it as something that revealed parts of themselves they had ignored for years. That's a profound shift, because growth always begins the moment we stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" Another practical example comes to mind. Picture a successful businessman whose schedule is always full. His calendar is packed with meetings, flights, and deadlines. He prides himself on staying busy because busyness keeps uncomfortable emotions at a distance. One evening, he returns home after another exhausting day and notices a box tucked away in the back of his closet. Inside are old birthday cards, photographs, and small souvenirs from different chapters of his life. Among them is a handwritten note from someone he hasn't spoken to in years. He sits on the floor intending to glance at it for only a moment, but nearly an hour passes before he realizes how deeply he has been pulled into those memories. It isn't the objects themselves that move him. It's the realization that while he spent years building a successful career, he quietly neglected a part of his emotional life that mattered just as much. Suddenly, achievement feels incomplete without the connection he once took for granted. That's the emotional atmosphere surrounding this card. Your person isn't questioning whether they can continue living without you. They're questioning whether living that way actually feels meaningful anymore. This card also highlights an important truth about emotional maturity. Real growth doesn't happen when someone learns the perfect words to say. It happens when their actions finally begin matching the emotions they've carried all along. Your person seems to be arriving at a place where they understand that feelings hidden forever eventually become regrets. For a long time, they may have believed that waiting for the perfect moment was the responsible choice. But perfection has a habit of never arriving. Life isn't built on flawless timing. It's built on courageous moments when people choose honesty despite uncertainty. That lesson appears to be settling deeply into their heart. What fascinates me most is that they are beginning to see your absence differently. Earlier, they may have interpreted the silence between you as proof that the chapter had ended. Now they're starting to realize silence never answered the important questions. It merely delayed them. They still wonder how you're doing. They still catch themselves imagining conversations that never happened. They still find themselves comparing new experiences to memories the two of you created together. Those patterns reveal something important. They haven't simply remembered you, they've started understanding your significance in a way they couldn't before. Sometimes people only recognize the value of steady kindness after they spend enough time surrounded by temporary distractions. Your consistency, your presence, and the emotional safety you offered have become much clearer in hindsight. Here's another example that illustrates this beautifully. Imagine a woman who always watered the plants in her apartment every Sunday morning. It became such a routine that she barely thought about it. One weekend, she left for an extended trip and asked a neighbor to care for them. When she returned, most of the plants were still alive, but they had lost their vibrancy. They weren't dead, they simply hadn't received the same attention they were accustomed to. Relationships often mirror that reality. Love isn't sustained by grand gestures alone. It's nourished by consistency, attentiveness, and the countless small moments that rarely receive applause. Your person appears to understand that now. They're recognizing that what they once viewed as ordinary care was actually something rare. It's difficult to replace someone who made consistency feel effortless. Another message woven into this card is the gradual disappearance of fear. Not because fear has completely vanished, but because something stronger has taken its place. Regret has begun outweighing hesitation. That's an important emotional turning point. Fear asks, what if they reject me? Regret asks, what if I never give them the chance to know how I truly felt? Those questions produce very different choices. Your person seems to be shifting from the first mindset into the second. They're beginning to understand that remaining silent guarantees nothing changes, while honesty at least creates the possibility of healing, understanding, or closure. Even if the outcome remains uncertain, speaking the truth begins to feel more peaceful than endlessly carrying it alone. As I continue reflecting on this energy, I also sense that your person has become much more aware of time, not in a dramatic or fearful way, but in a deeply human one. They've realized how quickly months become years and how easily people assume there will always be another opportunity. Think about how often we postpone important conversations because tomorrow feels guaranteed. We tell ourselves we'll call next week, apologize another day, or explain everything when life becomes less complicated. Then one day we look back and discover that the distance between two people wasn't created by one terrible decision. It was created by hundreds of postponed moments that quietly accumulated over time. Your person seems determined not to let that pattern continue forever. This card ultimately carries a quiet sense of readiness, not perfection, because nobody reaches perfection before opening their heart, not certainty, because vulnerability always involves uncertainty. Instead, it carries readiness, born from honesty. They are beginning to understand that protecting themselves from emotional risk has also prevented emotional fulfillment. The walls they built to avoid disappointment eventually became barriers separating them from the connection they valued most. Now, those walls no longer feel like protection. They feel like isolation. As we prepare to move into the next part of this reading, one truth echoes louder than anything else. Your person's greatest battle is no longer against their feelings. That battle has already been decided. Their greatest challenge now is finding the courage to let those feelings exist outside the privacy of their own heart. Everything we've uncovered so far has been preparing them for that moment. The realization, the memories, the accountability, and the emotional growth all point toward one inevitable conclusion. They are becoming someone who understands that love hidden forever eventually becomes the heaviest burden a heart can carry. The next card reveals what happens when that burden finally becomes too heavy to keep holding alone. As I turned over the final card, I couldn't help but smile, because everything we've uncovered throughout this reading finally came together. This card doesn't feel loud, dramatic, or rushed. It feels like the quiet moment that arrives after someone has spent weeks, months, or even years arguing with themselves. There comes a point when the heart grows tired of carrying conversations that never leave the mind. Your person has reached that point. They are no longer trying to convince themselves that staying silent is the noble choice, or that burying their emotions will somehow make them disappear. Instead, they're beginning to understand that honesty isn't only a gift you offer someone else, it's a gift you offer yourself. Living behind emotional walls eventually becomes more exhausting than opening the door. Imagine someone standing on the edge of a lake just before sunrise. The water is perfectly still, reflecting everything around it. They could spend hours wondering how cold the water might be, or how difficult the first step will feel, but eventually there comes a moment when thinking has to give way to action. The first step is always uncomfortable, yet it's also the only step capable of changing anything. Your person's emotional journey resembles that moment. They've spent enough time analyzing, remembering, questioning, and replaying the past. Their heart is quietly reminding them that answers rarely arrive through endless thinking. They arrive through courage. One final example comes to mind. An elderly couple was once asked what kept their marriage strong for over 50 years. The husband smiled and said, "We learned early that silence solves very few problems. Whenever one of us wanted to walk away from a conversation, we promised ourselves we'd come back before the day ended." That simple habit didn't make them perfect. They still disagreed, misunderstood each other, and made mistakes. The difference was that they never allowed pride to become more important than connection. Your person seems to be learning that same lesson, perhaps later than they wish. But sometimes the most valuable lessons arrive only after life has shown us what we stand to lose. The strongest message from this final card is beautifully simple. They're done protecting you from how they truly feel, because they finally realized those feelings were never the enemy. Fear was. Pride was. Uncertainty was. Those were the things creating the distance, not love. Whether they choose to express everything immediately or take small steps forward, something inside them has undeniably shifted. The emotional walls that once seemed permanent have begun to crack, allowing honesty to find its way through. If this reading found you today, perhaps its greatest reminder isn't only about what someone else may be experiencing. It's also about you. No matter what another person chooses, never underestimate the peace that comes from staying true to your own heart. Continue building the life that fulfills you. Continue becoming the version of yourself that doesn't depend on someone else's decisions to feel whole. The right conversations happen when both people are ready to meet them with honesty instead of fear. And if that moment is approaching, it will arrive naturally, not because it was forced, but because truth has finally become stronger than silence. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this message resonated with your heart, carry it with hope rather than expectation. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen quietly, long before the outside world notices them. Until our next reading, take care of yourself, protect your peace, and remember this: genuine feelings can be delayed, hidden, or denied for a season, but they can never remain buried forever once the heart decides it's finally time to speak.